Hi, welcome to the Oak Trader Reports Part 1 today. Just covering a few of the Russian crosses in the Forex market, and I just thought I'd give you an update on what the currency was looking like, and it's not looking too good concerning the ruble. There's been a lot of press reports today saying how wonderful Putin is in terms of tactics, trying to make the West look weak. And all I can see that he's done is he's made a tremendous mistake. He's made a tactical error, I believe. And if you look at the Russian currency against the Canadian dollar, the Canadians have pulled their ambassador today, I believe, back from Moscow. You can see already where it is in terms of spiking, and it looks like it potentially is going to spike further, and the Russian ruble will again lose value, and this is going to push up the costs of imports in Russia. They export a lot of commodities, they don't produce a lot of finished goods. That all comes mainly from the West and from the East, and Russians exchange their commodities for finished goods. And you can see here in terms of the currency, and I'll show you against the Swiss franc, it's really beginning to pick up speed here, and you can see it spiking, and no doubt it's coming up to about 5 in the morning Hong Kong time. New Zealand's open now. The Forex markets will begin, and we should see this spike further, and this will put more pressure on Russia to move out of the Crimea, and you can see it here against the Euro FX as well. You can see a lot of this is you could almost say pre-planned. I mean, these types of spikes, and then you've got Crimea here, but look at these types of moves as well. You can see that from the beginning of the year, some very smart analysts, and the market was prepared quite well, but a lot of people could see this on the horizon and weren't allowed to talk about it or really mention it. But you can see here the type of preparation and the spikes. Even with the European economy the way it is, you can see what investors think of the Russian currency at the moment, and it could get a lot worse for the Russians in the foreseeable future. The Great British Pound here against the ruble gone from 45 up to 60, and it's definitely spiking. Again, when a market's spiking, it's always quite dangerous, but with what Russia's done over the last couple of days in terms of invading the Crimea, it is looking like the ruble is set for a period of destabilization. John Kerry just came out today on a few of the American networks saying that they were going to target the currency at some point, if indeed they try to annex the Crimea. And you can see the Japanese yen, even with the Japanese massive money printing that pushed down the value of the yen. You can see from the beginning of the year the spike that's developing. I wouldn't be surprised to see that go much higher in the ensuing weeks. And all of this is going to put even more pressure on Russia and destabilize their country, because a lot of Russians now in the last 5 years, if you've ever visited Asia or parts of the Mediterranean, they've become new tourists, so to speak. So a lot of Russians have been visiting different parts of the world, taking their holidays abroad, and they're not going to appreciate their currency being devalued over the next few months, if indeed that is to happen. But that, I'm sure, will put a lot of pressure on Putin, and we'll see what happens from there. The Polish Zloty, rumours of the Poles moving to the border with Ukraine, just rumours at the moment, and I can't see anything really happening in terms of a huge dispute here between Russia and other countries. It may be a war between Russia and Ukraine. That is entirely possible now. But I think it's going to be a stalemate for quite a long time. It's hard to predict how things are going to work out. A lot of the Crimea gets a lot of its water from the mainland of Ukraine, and it's not as if Russia doesn't have enough territory, as we'll see later on in a map of the world, and they have plenty of room in the Black Sea as well. I think symbolically, because of what the Crimea means to Russians, this is why it's so important to them in terms of what people talk about in being a strategic location. Of course it is, because it juts out into the Black Sea, but in terms of warfare, it means nothing these days. Navies really don't mean that much, and Russia has a huge Black Sea coast. It isn't part of their territory, and it does look like that they have tried to annex the Crimea. And you had the Ukrainian riot police, the ones I think work for the Ministry of Interior, the ones supposedly were supposed to have shot over 100 protesters with snipers. And of course there's always conspiracy theories about who is responsible, but one thing I noticed in the last 3 days, when they went down to Crimea, when Yankovic was fleeing, and these riot police were given flowers by the people in Sevastopol. They were given red roses and welcomed as heroes, and supposedly also they were handed Russian passports as well. Not one of them, and I look at news sources from all different areas, not just mainstream sources, not one of them denied being involved, killing all those innocent protesters. Some of them of course were quite violent, and I'm not saying there wasn't violence from both sides, but I think in those last 3 days, the riot police, by snipering off innocent people, rather than standing and fighting with them, took a different approach, and I haven't heard any of them deny that they did that. And that seemed strange to me. That seemed also a confirmation that they did actually do that, and that's why they fled down to the Crimea. One tactical mistake I think Putin's made as well is that it's quite obvious, I think the plan now is to install Yankovic as the president of the Crimea. But one of the big mistakes he made, he should have done that when he first fled Kiev. Instead of fleeing to the Crimea, he fled to eastern Ukraine, then down to Balaclava in the Crimea, and then who knows how he got to Russia, but he ended up in Russia. If this invasion of the Crimea came solely from the people, he could have stayed in the Crimea, Yankovic. He wouldn't have had to flee. He could have done all that Russia has done, taking over military bases and whatnot, without having to flee to Russia. But he had to go to Russia because the people of the Crimea generally don't want any strife. There was a Gallup poll there not so long ago where 54% wanted to remain and keep the status quo. And also, if you look back at history, you know, the Ottoman Empire, the modern day Turks have more of a claim to Crimea than the Russians do. They were in possession of the peninsula for over 350 years. So you can always go back to history, and also the deportation of the Crimean Tatars during Stalin's time, the depopulation of the peninsula and replacing them with Russians. And you know, this all reflects back perhaps to say Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. There's lots of these flashpoints in the world. But you know, one people can't claim to own somewhere, and generally the people of the Crimea, Sevastopol, Simferopol, they get on very well. There's no real major ethnic tension there at all, and everything seems to have been stirred up in terms of, in the last 2 or 3 days, using it as an excuse to invade the Crimea, that ethnic Russians were going to be genocidally slaughtered there, which is a complete fabrication. If anyone's ever been there, that's very far from the truth. And then you could say, well, what about all the so-called fascists and Nazis up in Kiev? Well, they're, for a start, over 1,200 kilometers away, 1,000 kilometers away, up in the north, and also it's been massively exaggerated. A small percentage of those protesters you're talking perhaps 5 to maybe 15% hold far right views. Generally, 85% of those people that were protesting in the Maidan Square, which is an Arabic word, I believe, which is quite interesting, did not, at all come from that persuasion. They were just ordinary Ukrainians. Of course, I'm not saying that they weren't riled up by probably some of Soros's support groups, and we all know that goes on. But I think one of the things to mention, I read a text message on the BBC Live service, someone saying in Portugal, an English expat, a real idiot, saying Ukrainians shouldn't hope for being in the EU. They should see what it's like living in Portugal at the moment. The guy hasn't got a clue. Ukraine, if you look at the Doing Business Index, is around 160th worldwide for doing business. It's an absolutely terrible country to do business with, and so's most of Russia really as well. Company kidnap, in terms of coming over and taking over your company, repossessing the assets, officialdom, bureaucracy, bribery. It really is like an African country in Europe in that respect, in terms of corruption. So I mean, guys like that saying, don't come to the EU, they haven't got a clue. The EU is one of the best places to live in the world. I'm not saying there isn't issues, there is. But in terms of society, trying to compare that to Ukraine could do a lot worse than moving towards Europe. It hasn't obviously worked, being closer to Russia. And the Ukrainian people, the Russian speakers as well, they're quite united. And I think they've come up with a plan now which is quite devious and quite tactical, where they're putting the rich businessmen of eastern Ukraine, which are traditionally affiliated with Russia, they're putting them in charge as governors, which is a very sly tactical move, because a lot of these guys, machoism, they don't want to be under Putin's thumb as much as the next oligarch, but they will, for business. And if they can be in charge of their own province, it's going to be a lot better than being under a war footing for the next 10 or 15 years. These guys don't want to have their assets frozen in Europe and America and places like that. So I can see things settling down. I just can't see how Putin can back out of this. I think he's made a tremendous tactical error here, and especially with what I'm showing you here, even the ruble, losing huge ground against the Zloty. I mean, this is not something Putin can fend off, and a lot of the commentators have failed to mention that today, about the depreciation of their currency, about inflation coming to Russia. And if anyone's been to Moscow, you can see the costs of goods, and it's only going to get worse with the devaluation of the ruble. And you can see here as well, against the US dollar, supposedly the US dollar in the death throes of losing its status as the world currency, and now you can see the result of having an economy and a populace that are allowed really to do what they want in a lot of different ways. Now I know that there's a lot of freedoms that have been rescinded, and a lot of terrible things have gone on, in terms of the Constitution in America, and freedoms have been rescinded. But if you compare it to Russia overall, if you compare it in a fair way, I would prefer to live in the United States and live under the laws there a million times over living somewhere, say, like Russia. And that's nothing against the Russian people, it's just the Russian bureaucracy, company kidnap, not being able to do business in an efficient way or a trustworthy way. And also as well, some of the rhetoric coming out of Russia in the last couple of years to do with an anti-gay bias and all these stupid laws. And it is totally ridiculous in terms of trying to move forward in the world, you know, concentrating on your laws like Uganda's brought out recently. Who can blame now? You can blame the West for some of Africa's problems, but I think people are seeing now, it's like Venezuela. It's down to the people that run the country ultimately. They make their choices. They have a chance to develop and move forward, yet they concentrate on these stupid subjects. And we do it in the West as well, but we tend to get over that and get on with business, whereas these countries seem to take it too personally. You know, in Uganda over the weekend, I think it was about 3 days ago, they had a hit list of the top homos in Uganda. It made me laugh, just how caveman like putting out an article like that in this type of world that we live in the moment. And you got to think to yourself, if you're a Ugandan business and you're trying to attract foreign capital, there's just no way, you know, unless you're a conglomerate, that you're going to go into Uganda. And it's not necessarily to do with the infrastructure in the country. People will always back a country that has the right progression, the right rules, the right laws. And Uganda, you know, by bringing out that law, you know, life imprisonment and persecution, and putting it on the newspapers, and a nationalistic newspaper which has one of the highest circulations had a little corner square that said hang 'em. You know, it's ridiculous. That type of society is just going to go backwards. And it's the same with Russia. You know, Putin concentrating on the anti-gay legislation. I understand where they're coming from, you know, in terms of their you know, he's trying to come out with something populistic. You know, he's trying to win votes. He doesn't, you know, probably give a crap about it. But the point of fact is, it just shows investors how backward, and also with this tactical error of the invasion of the Crimea, and it is a severe tactical error. I can't see anyone wanting to invest in Russia over the long term. Of course, you're always going to get conglomerates. You know, they'll invest anywhere. Look what they did to Nigeria, Shell. The murder of the peace activists there, trying to stop all the pollution in the Niger Delta. I never can pronounce his surname. Sarawala, I think his surname was. Shell basically let him hang, but that was totally out of order. But these big corporations, they will go to countries, but the people with the money, in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, France, Italy, America, they're not going to want to do business with country like Russia if it carries on with what it's doing. The simple reason being is you can't trust you know, someone that does this in terms of what they're looking aggressive wise to achieve. You just can't trust your money in a country where, you know, the stories come out about hedge funds having their money repossessed, opposition leaders being jailed, which I'll show you pretty soon. You can see the old map of Russia here with the octopus, and there's the Ukraine. I just thought it was an interesting map from 18, I think just after the Light Brigade probably. And then here's the small vectors index in Russia. You can see it dipping below the pivotal points here where my mouse is. And the point I was making before, sorry, I was just getting distracted by some Forex quotes, was if sanctions do come in, Russia's welcome to deal with the rest of the world. But I think anyone who knows about business, if you've got a business, you want to deal with countries that pay. And countries like Canada, Australia, America, you know, they pay you. If they take something, they'll pay you. Whereas other countries that Russia can do business with, they'll delay payment. They won't pay them in cash. They'll pay them in commodities. And, you know, the deterioration of living standards in Russia will go right down if he doesn't pull out of the Crimea very soon, because it's just one step too far. It's all right doing it in South Ossetia and Georgia, and of course the the Georgians were partly responsible for that, and that, I think that's one of the reasons why they were let off the hook pretty easily with that, because the Georgians did instigate some of what went on in the beginning. But this is just one step too far. And I think if anyone knows as well, in terms of Ukraine, there isn't the political unrest. I mean, there was an article I saw as well on Russian TV, I think it was on Channel 1 in Russia, talking about mass exoduses to the Russian border with Ukraine, that Russian Ukrainians were fleeing, and it was just totally not true. And they used a picture of the Polish-Ukrainian border. So all the propaganda moves are coming out again, and all those conspiracy theorists in America. I would say this to you, you know, some of what you say is right, but I think, you know, in terms of watching Russia today, I think they've proved themselves to be a real propaganda tool of the establishment in Russia, and you've got a lot of evidence to suggest that in terms of false flags and false attacks, you know, Putin has been responsible for a lot in Russia itself, and I think there's a lot of evidence of that. So people like this Max Kaiser and also Alex Jones and others, you know, I think they really either don't understand the political implications of backing someone like Russia today or Putin, or they, you know, are getting a nice payment as well, because it's, you know, the world isn't always black and white. There's plans within plans, and sometimes what they talk about in terms of a conspiracy, they don't realise sometimes the alternative. And I think people like Putin, if you actually lived in his Russia, you know, you would see that, yeah, okay, some Russians have benefited in the last 10-15 years, but it's just as corrupt as it was. Russia could be a great country, it could be an absolute powerhouse, but again, you've got that top echelon, you know, ruling elite, where you've got $1 billion worth of aircraft at the Kremlin now. You know, whilst the standard of living for the majority of Russian people is extremely low. And it's just the same, nothing's changed, and the Russian people are quite heavily brainwashed, just as we are in the West in some ways. But I think through the young people I've met in the West and the young people I've met in Moscow, they're far more open to being manipulated by their government, the young people in the West, whereas the ones in Moscow seem to be very drone-like and brainwashed. Well, the ones I meet in Asia anyway that come over here, they seem to believe the rhetoric of their government, and Putin's the man. You know, his machoism is it's like the old Romans when they come back to conquer something, Crimea. You know, Putin wants his triumph in Moscow, but it's just a severe tactical mistake, I think. But maybe I'm completely wrong, but I doubt it. Putin's going to learn a big lesson from this. And you can see the Smallcap index dipping down, and then you've got the Russia Bull index 3 times long. All these ETFs as well, I'd never really trust trading them or have a lot of money in them. They've all got dodgy terms and conditions, so whatever you can do, try and take a position, you know, without using an ETF if possible. And if you do take a position with an ETF, spread it between you know, 2 or 3 of them that handle the same sector, because, you know, one day they're not to be trusted, these ETFs. Yeah, you could say this was basing. You know, you've got the triple bottom here, but one thing here, you can see the time spent in this lower reaches, and then you can also see that it could dip down quite easily here, and you've got this line here that you can draw along, and if it did break that at any point, you know, perhaps I would go long, but to me this looks like it's behaving if it's going to go down even further. And you can see, I mean, look, it's gone from 150. I know this is a highly leveraged ETF, down to all the way down to 15. It's taken an absolute pummeling. That's why I think he's made a, you know, an absolutely terrible mistake. Maybe he's done this actually because sometimes war diverts people's attentions. You know, if Russia's going to go through an absolutely horrible period for their economy, and the people are going to suffer. Who better to blame than the old enemy, the West? You know, and it looks like it's shaping up that we're going to take the blame for their economic mess, and starting a little war in Crimea may have been his reasons behind that. Now, yeah, that may be the case. I hadn't have thought about that before, but that is quite often the case. You know, that when countries are in financial difficulties, you know, instead of actually getting their house in order, they will look for a boogeyman, you know, to blame, and the populace do normally suck it up as well if they're not well educated. Right, there's Gazprom Neft, and you can see here the bounce in 2009, and it just lower highs, one high, one high, one high, one high, all lower. You know, that signals to me that the market's going to take a big dip pretty soon. I wouldn't call this an accumulation triangle. To me it looks more like a distribution triangle, and the market's going to dip much lower from here. This is another Gazprom funny. When I call it a funny company, I mean it's basically state controlled really. And you can see here it has had a long-term downtrend line broken, but you couldn't call this a gradual downtrend line. It went from 18 to 6. That's not gradual. So if any line developed that was gradual and it broke it, I may have, you know, more confidence in it. I'm sure some of the assets are undervalued, but again, you know, Russia's a country that's going to have huge issues if they carry on the same path. And you know, oil and gas is a highly technical area, and every man and his dog is into it at the moment in every country around the world. So it's not exactly like they've got something that, you know, nobody else has. You know, eventually people are going to be coming up with their own energy supplies. And also, yeah, that was another point I wanted to bring up. The European Union, you know, could get along quite easily without Russian gas. It's quite a big myth. You know, the UK, France, Italy, all these different countries, they have lots of different gas storages and lots of different ways to get gas into the country. And then you've got Libya right on the doorstep of France and Spain. You know, you see there's a lot. You've got Algeria as well. There's a lot of different options, and Norway as well. It's not the only game in town. And the German pipeline to Russia, that may be in jeopardy as well. I do like Angela Merkel, and I think she's the only one that can talk some sense into Putin. I heard she had a chat with him about an hour ago on the phone, and I think he's well, she's the only leader that Putin trusts. She speaks fluent Russian. She's lived under Russian occupation. She's an East Berliner, I believe, East Germaner anyway. So yeah, I think she can maybe slap him around a bit and get him to see a bit of sense. Yeah, this was Olga, a little point that she made. I just picked up from the BBC text. I'm amazed that some, I mean, these could be false, these texts, and they could well be real as well. But I think she makes a good point that I'm amazed that some of the people writing on here hold a view that this is democracy in action. Beggars belief. If Crimea wants to have a referendum, that is one thing, but invading a foreign country with a military force is something else altogether. Please, please, let's not mix these 2 points. And that's a really good point she made. And then I saw another guy talking about you know, how the parliament in Kiev had been taken over by protesters, and people didn't complain about that, but now they're complaining that people have taken over the Crimea one. The big difference between that is that they were Ukrainian people that took over the parliament in Kiev. These were not Ukrainian people that took over the parliament in the Crimea. They were Russian, so that is a huge difference. This guy here, Henry Macau, I've seen him around a few times on Twitter. Russia acted because new Zionist government in Ukraine would scrap Crimea naval base, crippling Russian naval power. I mean, it just shows you how ridiculous some people are. If you just look at a map, Russia has a huge Black Sea coastline. You know, anywhere along that coastline, they could pretty much park boats. Of course, only certain areas are suitable for harbours, but they've got suitable areas. They've got an absolutely huge coastline in the Black Sea, and also they've got an agreement to have a naval base in Sevastopol. And there was no way that the government, and it isn't a Zionist government, but there's no way that the government, the new government in Kiev, would have scrapped the naval base in Crimea. It's just a lame excuse. No way would they have done that. You know, they might be a brave new government, so to speak, angry about certain things, but that's one thing that they wouldn't have done straight away. And Russia could have said, well, no, we don't agree, we're just going to stay here for the term of our lease. So, you know, saying stuff like that is just completely ridiculous. I don't know where this guy gets his analysis from, but he's obviously a complete tosser. He just doesn't have a clue what he's on about. Because the fact is, even if the government was that bad, let's say that they were neo-Nazis, Zionists and fascists. I've heard them called all sorts of names, the new government in Kiev. But let's say they were like that. What, Russia couldn't have stood up to them and said, no, we're keeping our naval base because we had an agreement. You know, they already were, you know, had a lot of goodwill in the world community, so to speak, through their, what some would term, you know, peace negotiating over Syria. You know, they had a lot of goodwill. It just wouldn't have been allowed to happen, and it's not as if Russia could have been bullied that easily. Chris Weafer here, Moscow-based investment expert, says the escalating crisis in Ukraine, threats from the West pose little danger to Russia's economy. He explains that 80% of the country's exports are commodities and that the bulk of its imports are sourced from the EU. I don't think this guy understands, you know, currency movements, you know, currency devaluations. You saw the charts I showed you of the Russian Ruble. You asked me a question. If you're a businessman and the currency you use in your home country depreciates by 30, 35, 40%, who knows where it's going to end up, let's say 50%, it's not going to have effect on your business. It will have little or no effect. I don't know how this guy can be called an investment expert. I don't know where they get these people from. Pose little danger to Russia's economy. I mean, that has got to be one of the most ridiculous comments. Chris Weafer, I'll have to remember that name. The trade and investment relationship with the US is less important, and major corporations such as Boeing or ExxonMobil, who have been active in Russia for many years, have historically sidestepped political disputes. That's fair enough. Maybe they will, like we talked about before, the largest of the large corporations. But you can't tell me that you know, a lot of mid-sized businesses in the UK, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Holland aren't going to think twice about moving into Russia. It's going to affect it a lot. The foreign direct investment is going to take a huge dip. No one's going to want to invest over there whilst this political uncertainty is ongoing. That's for sure. So I don't know how this expert can say it poses little or no danger to Russia's economy. And then on top of that, he hasn't checked any forex charts for the last 6 months or a year. I mean, I don't know where they get these people from, and this is what the internet is full of, people that call themselves experts but don't really have any you know, medals in the field, so to speak. You know, the EU, in fairness, is full of those people, and so's the American Senate and other countries. So, but you know, the good thing about our countries is, you know, there's a more balance between what you would call feudalism and people who have got rational common sense. So I thought I'd put this up here, the upside down world map, just to show you how absolutely large Russia is. And if you look where my map is here, you can see the Ukraine there, and that little dot there where my mouse is. That's just where Sevastopol, the capital, Simferopol, and Sevastopol is where they've got the Russian base and the nuclear subs. And opposite you got Turkey, which was the old Ottoman Empire, and that used to have control of the Crimea for, I think, for 400 years until Catherine the Great came in and took it for Russia. So it's got quite a history. It used to be the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire as well. But you see here Russia, and you look at Ukraine, and then you look at this area here. They've got a huge area of Black Sea to have for themselves. You know, the next thing is they'll be wanting access to other areas of the North Sea, and that this is where Lithuania and Latvia have got a right to be worried. You know, their countries, I believe, have 20-30% Russian speakers as well. But does that mean that Russia can go in and occupy those countries as well? And then it's got a trade route out into the North Sea. I mean, it's just that the country's huge, but yet the greed. I mean, why bother? You know, why not focus on building your country up, making it modern, you know, making people's lives better? But instead, Putin seems to want to focus on war, you know, which is very strange. I mean, you've got this tremendous country, beautiful country. Look how big it is, and it's almost twice the size of America, or 1.8 times the size of America, and you can just see none of it is developed. It's so backward. As soon as you get out of, well, from this map it would be the eastern, but from a correct map, the right way around. Who can say what is the right way around? But it would be Western Russia is quite developed now. But if you go beyond that, it's just nothing land. It's peasants and basically people that haven't had any development for years. And then you've got areas along here that have seen development, and areas where there's oil and gas, but they just haven't really been good custodians of their real estate. You know, why focus on a huge area of issue here? Fair enough, you know, protect the ethnic Russians, protect your naval base. You could have all done that from the naval base. You didn't have to take over pretty much the whole of the Crimean Peninsula, which was a ridiculous thing to do, and there was never really any threat of nationalists, fascists and neo-Nazis coming down to the eastern Ukraine and massacring a load of people. That just was a fantasy. You know, it's a very small minority, like in every country, like France, America. You know, every country's got its small minority of you know, people that have extreme views, but that doesn't mean that they could have gone all the way to the eastern part of Ukraine and massacred ethnic Russians. It just wouldn't have happened. It's fairyland. Yeah, this was the Financial Times correspondent confirming what I'd seen a Ukrainian reporter write up about the propaganda coming out of Russia at the moment. Drove to Ukrainian-Russian border, no sign of refugees, border guard calls Russian reports on people fleeing nonsense. And that is a fact now. I've seen that in 3 or 4 different posts, and also the visuals as well from the actual Russian broadcast. You can clearly confirm, because I've been to that border spot where it was, that it was the border spot between the Ukraine and Poland, not the Ukraine and Russia. So they really need to sort out their propaganda. It needs a little bit of readjustment. Okay, yeah, tomorrow I'll put together some charts as well concerning the American markets and a couple of other markets I'm taking an interest in. There's some amazing opportunities at the moment, and I'll get that out later on. I've also got some details about the Bitcoin, my thoughts on that as well, and also another tape reading of Market Tactics Part 3. But yeah, just concerning Bitcoin briefly, again, MT Gox is just an exchange. It's like a futures brokers like Refco going out of business, or those scumbags, Lehman Brothers, whatever company you know, deals in products. You have to be and take precautions. I never speculate in terms of buying and selling something that I don't understand in terms of its value, as I talked about before. Something like Bitcoin and the price action of the chart could get me into it in the future, and I think it still will be around for a long time. But don't get confused out there. There's a lot of reports saying that this is the end of Bitcoin. It's nothing of the sort. Mt. Gox was just a company that allowed you really to speculate on bitcoins. You don't have to keep your bitcoins at an exchange. You can keep them on your own hard drive, or even on serial codes that are printed out. But you know, the fact is, a lot of commentators have got confused about that on the internet, and they don't seem to understand that bitcoins is a completely separate entity to any company that goes bankrupt. It has its own algorithms, it's its own thing, whereas Mt. Gox was a company that was set up so people could buy and sell bitcoins. And companies will go bankrupt, and that's down to the populace to do their due diligence and not be stupid idiots and check the terms and conditions. A friend of mine, this was about 6 months ago, told me about the terms and conditions at Mt. Gox, in terms about getting your money back, and how they'd take a long time to send you the money back if this happened or that happened, and he didn't deal with them because of their terms and conditions. You know, always you know, read terms and conditions, especially if you're dealing with something that's going to cost you a lot of money if it goes wrong. You know, people need to take a lesson, and that's how we get a strong system. You know, if we go back to the capitalist system of letting companies fail, the real capitalist system, and it works, because what happens is eventually you get a populace that's highly intelligent and is on the lookout for scammers, because they've been scammed so many times in the past. But when you've got this nanny society that we're starting to create today, you know, that doesn't allow people, so to speak, to be scammed, you know, and they allow companies that run up huge debts to stay in business, no one ever learns any lessons, and you become a weak society, and intelligence levels drop. You know, and that's the beauty about free markets, wild markets, is the fact that people do learn, and that's what life's about. It's about learning. Okay, over and out, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye bye now.